Hi, and welcome to the XStore Point of Service DTX Framework session. In this session, you will learn about the XStore data sources and the data access objects that are used within XStore to communicate back and forth with the database. XStore's data lookup and persistence framework can be configured in a variety of ways to control where the application retrieves and persists data. These locations in XStore are called data sources and are defined in the data source config XML file. Other files that are used for configurations of these DTX framework is the DTX files, persistence manager config XML file, and the PM type mapping config XML file. Typical data source config XML file contains configurations for the following data sources: store primary, which is the primary lookup and persistence location for all transactional data, and all registers communicate with one store primary within the store. We have a local data source, which is a failover data source and is used when there is no external connections to any other data sources. An XCenter data source, which is a central data source that all stores have access to and is typically accessed over a wide area network. We have a replication data source, which is a local data source that's used for queuing up XStore data that needs to be replicated to the other data sources. There's also a training data source that's used strictly for XStore training mode. And optionally, you can have a store backup data source that's a secondary lookup and persistence location when the store primary is not available. Now I'm going to show you an example of a data source config XML file to go over some of the characteristics of these files. As you can see within these data source files, they have a name, they specify a network scope, which can be WAN or LAN, or sometimes even local. Also defines all the characteristics for connection information and or URLs that you need to use to connect to this particular data source. And in some cases, it specifies servlet information in the case of the XCenter database. All the data source objects contain a ping section, which is used to make sure that the connection is alive. It's used by XStore to periodically check to make sure that the connection is still alive and it knows that it can still use it. Now we're going to talk about the data access objects that the DTX framework uses. These are all defined in their own DTX files and are mapped to a single XStore database table. XStore provides a proprietary code generation process that generates all the source objects that are necessary for our ORM classes based on contents of these DTX files. This gives the ability to create their own DAOs as needed. Within XStore, the primary class used to access these DAOs and use these DAOs is the data factory class, which contains all the methods needed to retrieve and persist data through the DTX framework using these data access objects and or queries. Now I'm going to show you some examples of the other configuration files that are needed within DTX to make DTX functional. First file is the persistence manager config XML file, and this defines the ways and locations of where data is looked up and persisted for different types of location groups. There's 3 location groups within a persistent manager type. We have an online setting, an offline setting, and a training setting. And within each of those settings, you can have a lookup location and a persistence location. So as you can see in this first example of a store standard persistent manager type, we have an online definition for the location group that has a lookup location of store primary and a persistence location of store primary. For the offline location, it has a lookup location of store backup, a lookup location of local, and a persistence location of data source local. And what this does when you have multiple lookup locations, it will first look to the first lookup location data source to try to find the data. If it doesn't find the data there, it will then go to the next configured lookup location and look it up there. And if it finds it there, it uses that data. And if anything needs to be persisted, it persists to the persistence location defined for the particular location group being dealt with, whether it be online, offline, or training. Within this file, they can be referenced in other persistence manager types, so you don't have to define the entire definition of a persistence manager type if you only need to change the online lookup location definition. As you can see in this XCenter standard, it references the store standard persistence manager type, but only changes the online location group by adding another lookup location of XCenter to start with. The next file that we're going to show you is the PM type mapping config XML file. This is the file that actually links those persistence manager types, or PM types as they sometimes are called, to the actual tables in the database. They're linked by the object ID of the table. So as you can see, we have award account ID. This is for the award account table, and it's using loyalty as the PM type. And if we went back to the persistence manager and found loyalty listed in here, you can see that it actually references the XCenter standard as well. So it uses the definition of XCenter standard, but it's under a persistence manager type of loyalty. One of the other options in this file is to be able to specify whether we use property tables for the parent table. Property tables are never defined in the DTXs. They will automatically be generated from the custom code generation that generates the objects, provided that the parent table meets a few criteria, being that it has to have a primary key, has to have organization ID as one of the columns in the table, and it can't be an extension of another table. If it meets that criteria, that when the code generation process runs, it's going to automatically generate corresponding property tables that can be associated to the parent table. And the way that you would make these property tables active within XStore is within this PM type mapping config file as well. On the parent table, you would specify a load properties attribute equals true, like we see here on the customer account ID. And then you would also specify the actual customer account property ID in here as well, so you can specify a PM type for the property table. What this will end up doing is within XStore, you then have the ability to access the property tables from the main data model object for customer account in this case. The next file we're going to show is the definition of what a DTX file actually is. This is the definition of the actual table in the database, so that when it's used by the coding generation, it will generate the appropriate objects that it needs. So all DTX objects have a name, specify a package that they belong to, specifies the actual table name that it's a part of, and if it happens to implement any interfaces. And if there happens to be any custom coding, you can specify the model generator attribute on the DAO. And it will know when it goes to code the code generation that it will look for a specific custom coding model to include as well. What all is defined in this file is the fields, which correspond to all the columns in the database. You can specify a name, the column it associates to, the type that it belongs to, and if it happens to be part of the primary key. These names end up being the getters and setter method names in the data object that you would use throughout your coding. Other things that you can set within this DTX file are relationships to other tables, and those are done by creating a relationship tag within the DTX file. So this specifies a name, the type of relationship, and the child that it references. So in this case, we have a reference to a party ID cross-reference table, and it's a one-to-many type, meaning that for every one record in the party model, you can have many party ID cross-reference records. Additionally, you could also set up an inverse relationship in here. If there was a parent model that you wanted to access from within this model, you would specify an inverse relationship, and then it would create a get parent call in the data model when it's generated. Now, talking about the custom code that you can add to these data models in the case that you need more things to be done than just accessing the columns, you can use that by creating a base model class and specifying the model generator attribute in the DAO DTX definition. What you can do inside the base model class is define any other classes that you need that aren't necessarily just accessing the database columns. So as you can see here, this class always has to extend the abstract data model. And if it's a property table, to be used with property impl, or it's just data model impl and doesn't specify the property information. Then you can define overrides to methods that are auto-generated from the custom code and change the behavior of it. Or in some cases, you can actually just create your own methods in here that do things for you that would make it more of a convenience for you to use it from within the main data model. And this concludes the session on DTX framework.